My name is Mark Zoback. I'm a professor in the Geophysics department in the School of Earth Sciences. And what I want to talk about tonight is the geological sequestration of CO2. It's a project I'm carrying out with three of my graduate students who are identified here. And it's funded by the Stanford-led Global Climate and Energy Project, which some of you may know about. It's directed by Lynn Orr, the former dean of the School of Earth Sciences and a petroleum engineer. So my involvement is in sort of geologic aspects of geologic sequestration. And you'll see what that means as we get further along. And of course, what we're trying to do is address some of the large problems that face society, and that is, in particular, to provide energy to the world's growing population and the improved standard of living that goes along with energy consumption, but at the same time addressing some of the environmental consequences of energy use, especially fossil fuels, such as the accumulation of greenhouse gases, which are contributing to climate change. And you've all probably seen these kinds of records from ice cores, in which greenhouse gases of CO2 and methane are varying through time. The present is to the left. This is 400,000 years ago. And the inferred temperature changes that go along with them, this is done from oxygen isotopes. And so as you accumulate greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the climate warms up. When the greenhouse gases are low, the temperature goes down. And of course, the huge concern we have is that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is at unprecedented levels for the last few 100,000 years. In fact, the past 65 million years, CO2 in the atmosphere has never been this high, and it is going up at an alarming rate. Now, CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. Methane is a greenhouse gas. Water is a greenhouse gas. But there's simply no question that humans have perturbed atmospheric chemistry by the burning of fossil fuels. And you can see that with the Industrial Revolution beginning in the 19th century and this very, very rapid increase in atmospheric CO2, going from slightly less than 300 parts per million to on the order of 360 parts per million, almost a one-third increase in just a little bit more than 100 years. Now, one of my graduate students, Amy, did this calculation here. I'm going to spare you the gory details and jump right to the bottom line. I was giving a lecture in the geophysics class that I teach, and talking about the sort of the natural balance between the geologic processes that put CO2 in the atmosphere, which is basically volcanic degassing from mid-ocean ridges and the volcanoes associated with subduction zones. We know roughly how much CO2 it puts into the atmosphere. The number here is 8 times 10 to the 18th moles of CO2 per million years. Kind of a rather esoteric number that's a little bit hard to get your mind around. But weathering takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. Water and CO2 combine to form carbolic acid. Carbolic acid basically interacts with the rocks that are here surface, and the result is carbonate rocks, limestone, that forms in the ocean. And that's the sort of a natural process, and it's such a good sort of natural feedback mechanism on CO2 that for most of geologic time, for billions of years, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere hasn't changed more than about a factor of 2. And this has allowed basically life to evolve. Life to form, during the Precambrian and to explode roughly 550 million years ago at the beginning of the Paleozoic era. So we have this natural source, and that's volcanism. And we have this natural mechanism, weathering and the precipitation of carbonate in the ocean. And the other place it goes is it goes into silica dioxide, quartz or glass, as you know it, which forms the shells of diatoms, little marine organisms. So it's a real nice process. Okay? The problem is when you actually convert anthropogenic CO2 emissions to equivalent units, okay, what is man doing to the system compared to the natural process? The ratio is 73 to 1. So when you hear people say, well, CO2 goes up and down, and there are natural feedback mechanisms which kind of help temper the amount of CO2, keep in mind that what man is doing is 73 times the signal, coming from natural processes. It's really quite enormous. And so it's not easy to predict what the consequences are, but it's certainly going to lead to greenhouse warming, okay, of some degree. And this is a blow up of the signal, and you can see this very rapid increase. And of course, it has to be, the anthropogenic sources have to be big in order to have changed something as big as the atmosphere so much in such a short period of time. So, greenhouse processes, are responsible for global warming, and it's a complex process. We're trying to develop, better models, and that's, an effort that many scientists around the world are engaged in. There's no question that temperature is going up, and there's equally no question that greenhouse processes are contributing to the temperature increase. The degree to which it's responsible for all of the temperature increase, which you see here reflected through various types of data for 1,000 years by using tree rings and corals, machine record back along with ice cores, and you can see this rapid temperature increase of just about a degree in about 100 years. And, the effect of global warming is everywhere, and you can, as shown here by the retreat of the Arctic ice cap in just a 25-year period. The Arctic will be navigable during your lifetime. Okay, so you'll be able to take a cruise from Norway to the North Slope of Alaska. It's like going right over the top. And the consequences of different scenarios for what happens depending on how effective we are in dealing with greenhouse gases are pretty serious. And this shows a range of projections of temperature based on a range of assumptions, and of course nobody can predict the future. But nonetheless, all of these temperature changes of between 2 and 6 degrees are quite ominous. 2 degrees is a big temperature change. 6 degrees is almost unbelievable. So what do? We reduce energy use, conservation, we find new energy sources that don't produce greenhouse gases. We find some place to put the CO2 other than the atmosphere. That's what I want to talk about. All of the above, you bet. There is no single answer to this problem, and it's going to require a concerted effort over by many people in many different disciplines. And so I'm just going to talk about one thing that needs to be done. It is certainly not adequate by itself. If you look at where the CO2 comes from, and you would add up the area associated with all these sources of CO2, I think about 45% of the CO2 comes from burning mostly coal, petroleum, and natural gas to make electricity. About 1/3 of the CO2 in the atmosphere comes from transportation, cars and trucks, and airplanes, and the rest comes from everything else. So CO2 is coming from lots of different sources. This is a snapshot of the United States. I think if you looked at it globally, it would not be so different. Let's skip over this and talk about what it is we're trying to accomplish and what's the problem. And it's shown in this cartoon. If things go on as they've been going on, as the world population continues to increase, and as the standard of living of people in countries like China and India, 1 billion each, continue to increase, we can expect energy consumption to increase, and if the energy source continues to be fossil fuels, then CO2 is going to do this. It's just going to continue to increase with time. What we'd like to do is stabilize the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere to offset the increases that have occurred in the future. Now, you can sort of look, so how do you get rid of this area? You know, how do you go from here to here? Well, we can use fossil fuels a lot more efficiently than we have. So they can, engines can be more efficient. Drive a hybrid car. How many of you do? Okay. And engines can be more efficient. We can do also, we can convert to nuclear and renewables. You know, there's all sorts of things we can do. And what's illustrated here is sort of an estimate of, you know, assumed advances in these various areas will take us down to this orange line. And then we're left with what's called a gap. And the gap could be filled by still more technology. Carbon capture and disposal, I'll be talking about the sequestration part of it. Hydrogen and advanced transportation, hydrogen as a energy distribution system, and a variety of biotechnology. So it's going to take, you know, here's a list of 7 things, and you could probably make a list of 17 things that are needed to, and they all need to be done, and they all need to be done at a very large scale, as we'll see in a moment, in order to get us down to something like a stable amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Yes?
How much carbon is naturally sequestered each year? Do you know, it's just from plants and what?
You know, I'm not going to talk about the biologic cycle very much because it is a cycle, right? We exhale CO2 and plants inhale CO2. And so that's sort of, you know, that's sort of a fixed cycle, assuming that to a large degree there's not going to be a dramatic increase in either vegetation or animals. Of course, you need vegetation.
So do you have an idea of what level you need carbon emissions to be at to sustain what people do?
You know, most of these calculations and projections actually take that into account. It's simplistic, simplified to the point of being wrong, to assume that just as you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, the plants are going to soak it all up. You know, the example I give is, you know, every now and then I have eggs for breakfast. And eggs give me energy and keep me strong. Okay? They raise my cholesterol too, so I don't have them too often. You know, okay? But if I had a room full of eggs, it really wouldn't do me any good. I couldn't live. I die if I ate all the eggs. Plants can absorb a certain amount of CO2. But for a plant to grow, it needs water, it needs light, the soil conditions, it needs a lot of things. So we can't just assume that you know, there's a biologic fix. And there's been a number of tests, and the tests going on at Jasper Ridge that look at problems like this. Okay? So it's not the answer. And in the global climate models, the biologic component is incorporated into a lot of those models. There's a question there?
You had those various estimates for temperature increases that could occur as a result. Do those also assume these advances in energy consumption that you listed here? Or are those like worst case scenario going way up?
No. Well, the worst case scenario usually means we don't change this very much. And the best case scenario means we get something close to stabilization.
Okay.
And then, and that's what the different scenarios talk about, stabilization at different levels. A very common assumption in global climate models is to assume a doubling of atmospheric CO2. It says if we do, you know, if we really get after this problem now, we'll be lucky if we can stop atmospheric CO2 at about 550, about twice, you know, what it is now. Okay, and that's pretty serious. I mean, that's a huge increase over what's been historically the fact. Now, we're going to talk about big units, gigatons of carbon. And what you have to remember is, you know, what a gigaton corresponds to. 700 1 gigawatt power plants. And what does it take to actually affect these? Well, it takes timescales of decades, because it's going to take decades to kind of replace old and inefficient plants with new plants. are we going to use nuclear power to replace coal-burning power plants, for example? Well, nuclear power doesn't produce CO2. It does produce radioactive waste, and that's a huge problem in and of itself. So let's just say the radioactive waste problem will solve tomorrow, okay? And we want to convert over to nuclear power. Well, it's going to take decades for these plants to get old and need to be replaced, and many decades for the construction of these plants to occur. So part of the problem, a very big part of the problem, is the scale of the global energy system and how much CO2 we're actually generating today. And even if we started today with very intensive efforts, it's a very difficult thing to kind of slow down the rate and actually achieve any form of stabilization because the volumes are so big. You'll see that a little bit further. And of course, all of this is based on projections about things we know very little about. We're projecting rates of economic global growth, through the end of the 21st century. Well, if I knew how to do this, I'd be working at some investment bank and making a lot of money. Nobody knows what the economy is going to do and how fast it's going to grow. So, we make assumptions about rapid growth in some parts of the world and modest growth in others and no growth at all. We make assumptions about how technology is going to come to our aid. We make assumptions in the models about some of the physical and chemical and biological feedback mechanisms. And when you put it all together, you wind up with these, large variations in what the temperature change is going to be. But as I mentioned, even the most modest predictions of temperature change, 2 degrees or so, is a huge temperature change, the way it affects world agricultural systems and other forms of life. Yeah?
Would those temperature changes be felt equally all over the world, or would some areas be hit harder than others?
Some areas are hit harder than others, and not only that, the temperature changes associated with the ice cores sort of magnify the signal. Arctic and Antarctic temperature changes reflected in those records are probably about twice as big as the mean annual global temperature. Okay, so it's very uneven. The areas which are affected, though, very dramatically are the arid areas, which with a little bit of warming and they dry out a little bit and suddenly they're uninhabitable. And the zones in which agriculture is sort of pushing the latitudinal limits, like growing wheat without irrigation in Canada, huge industry, huge. You start messing around with temperature by a couple of degrees, and suddenly the latitude over which you can grow major crops changes markedly in different parts of the world. And so there's huge disruption. Now, some of the disruptions are slow, and people will adapt to it, but other disruptions can be quite rapid. And something I lecture about, but I'm not going to talk about today, is that what's really scary about the climate system is how rapid the geologic record, the ice core record, indicates that some of these fluctuations have been. So global warming is not only the slow increase of temperature, it's introducing a giant perturbation to a very complex system, and that can in fact produce unforeseen consequences which can have very short time scales and very large local effects. One way that people have talked about this gap here is in terms of wedges. Okay? In other words, if this is our job to get from this amount of carbon to this amount of carbon, we don't know how to do it. Right? We don't have a silver bullet. We don't have a single answer. So let's think about a suite of answers, and we'll define a wedge as something that can get to the scale of about a gigaton of carbon per year as a storage capacity, and we'll call that kind of a wedge. And then we'll stack up those wedges one at a time. So what I'm talking about is one of these wedges, geologic sequestration. Energy efficiency and more efficient automobiles, is another one. Conservation is another one. A switch to nuclear power might be another one. Nuclear power is not going to solve all our problems. Making coal-burning power plants more efficient might be another one, and so on. And so that's what I meant by, I showed you 7 and made some reference to 17. But, it's by adding up these solutions and concentrating one at a time and adding them to our arsenal of things that can be done to address this problem that some solution is possible. And so what we want to look at, and what our research program is looking at, is can geologic storage be one of these wedges? And if the answer is no, the answer might be no. The barriers to geologic sequestration are really quite formidable, and I'll talk about some of them. Then that's unfortunate, but it's not a showstopper. Then we put our efforts into one of the other wedges, and we just try to come up with a suite of solutions. So in the context then of geologic storage, what is it that people are talking about? And they're talking, about 3 basic ideas. One is we go to sort of abandoned oil and gas reservoirs. Okay? Now, CO2 is injected into many oil and gas reservoirs around the world now to actually enhance recovery. In other words, the CO2 lowers the viscosity of the oil, and the pressure of the CO2 can help push the oil out. So CO2 is an EOR, enhanced oil recovery technique. And then if you find the ideal situation, you just use the CO2 there, and you're all done. Or you use a completely depleted oil and gas reservoir in which you're no longer interested in producing oil and gas, and you use it as a repository. A second possibility is what's called a deep saline aquifer. This is like a sandstone body at great depth, full of pores, okay, and it's full of water, okay. Now, the water is not drinkable. It's not drinkable because it's basically been in contact with the rocks and minerals for so long that there's a very high concentration of salt in it, okay? So that's why it's called saline. So this water is not good to anybody for anything. These units are there, and so why not just fill it with CO2? And so we have a research project on this, on the abandoned oil and gas, and I'll mention it very briefly. We have a research project on this in saline aquifers. And the third possibility is unminable coal seams. Now, of course, you know about coal near the surface. It's mined, and of course one of the big sources of CO2. If you go to greater depths, if you can't, if it's not economic to mine the coal, it actually turns out to be a good place to put CO2. The CO2 sequestration is being investigated in all 3 of these geologic environments: unminable coal seams, deep saline aquifers, and depleted oil and gas reservoirs. And we're doing a project on each, and that's what I want to briefly tell you about. Now, what I'm not going to talk about is a lot of the barriers to doing this, and the biggest barrier is CO2 capture, storage, and transportation. I mean, obviously, if you're going to inject it at a point, if you don't have a local source, you've got to gather it up from wherever it's being produced and transport it to the site. Not only that, what's coming out of a smokestack is mostly nitrogen. Nitrogen in the atmosphere is no big deal. The atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. Okay? But if it's mixed in with CO2 and sulfur dioxide and various nitrogen gases, you've got to separate out the bad stuff and inject it, because if you try to inject everything, you're going to be injecting about 4 or 5 times the total volume, which just makes your job that much harder and more expensive. That's a big deal, and I'm not going to talk about it. So, the part of the problem I'm working on is how will CO2 injection influence the reservoir seal? Remember, we're not just going to put it down there. We need to keep it down there for time scales on the order of about 1,000 years. Okay? So is that possible? Will these, repositories hold enough CO2, and will they keep it there for long enough? Okay? I want to go back to some numbers just to put this in perspective. If we're looking for a wedge, right? A gigaton of CO2 per year is our goal. It's going to be part of the solution, okay? There is absolutely nothing magic about the number one. It is just, 1/7 roughly of the problem we have to deal with. But let's just say we have 7 solutions. So 1 gigaton of CO2, corresponds in terms of liquid volume of 25 million barrels per day. Okay, what does that mean? Well, worldwide oil production is 80 million barrels per day. So if we're going to inject CO2, if CO2 sequestration is going to be a wedge and provide like 1/7 or so of the total solution, we're going to have an enterprise on the order of about 1/3 of all the producing oil and gas wells around the world. And there are a lot of them. Okay? It's just huge. Okay? That's, and that's to accomplish part of the solution. It's just a very, very daunting test. And as we consider it, we want to know whether it's secure, how much capacity is there, is it safe and effective, how do we know it's working and not being injected, how do we know it's staying there? What do you do when something goes wrong, and what do we do as we attempt to address these questions through research? Now the good news is that there is CO2 being injected in the earth for a wide variety of reasons around the world. And most of these are EOR, enhanced oil recovery, or EGR, enhanced gas recovery, or ECBM, enhanced coal bed methane recovery. I'll explain that in a moment. And there are a few pilot projects. Sleipner is a pilot project for CO2 sequestration I'll talk about here in a minute. But most of these are tied to oil and gas operations. But it is being done, and it's being done, relatively safely, but at a scale which is, maybe a millionth of what we need to accomplish. Yeah.
When they inject the CO2 for intense oil recovery, do they keep it down there, or do they just inject it and then
Well, they inject it and don't really worry about what happens to it as long as it's driving the oil. So when the CO2 injection process would stop, what you want to make sure is that it's not coming back out of the injection well. So you want to plug it so you shut it.
Right now it just comes back out.
No. You wouldn't want to. If you're going to spend the money and go through the trouble of injecting it, you're not going to just let it come out. So if you're not injecting, you just shut the well in. Okay. But in most cases, it's not being done to keep it there permanently. It's just being done for the temporary advantage of forcing the oil out. In the case of Sleipner, they actually drilled so it's an offshore platform, many wells, and then they were producing CO2 along with the hydrocarbons, and so what they did is they drilled an extra well into a saline aquifer, and they started to inject it. Okay, and that was to avoid paying a carbon tax to the Norwegian government. Okay, if they vented the CO2, it would cost them a lot of money. So instead, they drilled an extra well and they're injecting it. And this is kind of a seismic section. Each of those lines are reflections off of a geologic layer, kind of like ultrasound. Okay, and here's what it looked like in '94 before they started injecting. They've injected, and you can see that gas enhances the reflectivity of the units, and here's more gas in 2001. So it's spreading out away from the injection well. You can see that here. This is a map view. So there's the injection well, and you can see the CO2 spreading out, and it's moving up through the geologic section, but it's not too bad. So this is sort of a monitoring effort to assure that it actually stays where it's being put. Yeah?
How economically feasible is this for developing countries?
it's not economically feasible at all. And it's part of the fundamental conundrum of whether or not we are going to deny developing countries the opportunity to develop while committing the same sins that we committed, or whether we're going to hold them to a higher standard than we managed to hold ourselves. So, right decision at its cost, really. The problem really in this case is not the developing world, and I'll tell you why. The amount of energy consumed, and therefore the amount of CO2 produced per capita, is directly proportional to the per capita gross domestic product of the country. So the wealthy countries are using the energy, the wealthy countries are creating the CO2. Okay? Now, the trick is for us to create technology that as the developing world catches up, they can just take advantage of these technologies, and so the cost is not borne by them, it's just a natural thing for them. In the research I'm doing with my students, what we're doing is we're trying to develop sort of geomechanical models of the Earth, what the forces are, what the rocks are like, what the fractures and the faults are like, and actually look at what the reservoir was like initially, what happened as it was being produced. Okay, did the oil and gas production mess up the initial seal that kept it in there, and what will happen when we actually inject. And we're carrying out these projects in collaboration with other research programs at 3 places around the United States. At a coal burning power plant in West Virginia, at the Powder River Basin in Wyoming. Now, I talked about Powder River Basin here a couple of years ago, and we started working here to look at a big environmental problem of actually producing unwanted waters as the coal bed methane was produced, and now we're looking at it as a site for CO2 sequestration. And Teapot Dome, which is a government-owned oil and gas field in Wyoming. I'll start with Teapot Dome. Teapot Dome is just a huge oil field in central Wyoming, as you can see here, and it's actually well located with respect to sources of CO2. There's a lot of wells, there's very good data, and the federal government owns it, which means all the data is in the public domain, and you have a way of doing long-term and stable research. If this were a privately owned oil field, such as the field just to the north, there'd be proprietary concerns, they'd produce some data, they wouldn't want to release the others, and their primary objective is to produce oil and make money. And that's fine for the oil. I drove over here because it looked like it would rain. But, if we're looking at, an experiment in CO2 sequestration, that's going to take wells out of production and require that all the data is released and so on. So Teapot Dome is a good place to work. Many of you may have heard of Teapot Dome because it is, perhaps the most notorious, well, Enron is now the most notorious oil and gas scandal that's rocked the U.S. But in this day, the Teapot Dome scandal was really something. You see this, the oil scandal steamroller is heading right to the White House. It really reached high, and it was a pretty severe scandal, and it was such a severe scandal they just shut it down. I mean, there was just no way to untangle the mess, and they shut it down for 50 years. And it reopened in 1976, and in 1977 was taken over officially by the Department of Energy. Okay, and in October of 2003, it was identified as a National Geological Carbon Storage Test Center. So this is the way the government works, if you want to pretend you're doing something, you just label something. Oh yeah, we've got a big National Carbon Storage Test Center. They're not doing anything. We got one. You don't have to be a genius geologist to look at this structure from the air and actually see what's going on. It's a huge dome-shaped structure, and of course in the top it's going to load it off, but it's like that at depth. And it's like an inverted bowl, an elongated bowl, just full of oil and gas. It's a very prolific oil and gas field, but it produces very little intentionally. There are 1,500 wells, and 600 produce a very small amount of oil, and that's actually just to keep the process going, to keep the wells alive, and maintain the infrastructure. The production could be 100-fold of what it is. There are many different target reservoirs that have been identified for potential CO2 injection, and we're working now along with the local scientists to look at this. And what we're concerned with, okay, so here's another one of these seismic sections, and these colored lines represent faults in the various formations. And our biggest fear is that the injection, the pressure associated with injecting the CO2, has the potential for reactivating some of these faults, making them slip. Now, the earthquakes that might be associated would be extremely small. Okay, it's not the fact that we're worried about the shaking induced by the slipping faults, but when the faults slip, it increases their permeability and provides conduits for the CO2 to get out. That's the big fear. And so we're trying to assess which parts of the reservoir might be better than other parts of the reservoir in order to do pilot experiments. And we had a conference call today, I have a meeting on this tomorrow, and this research is just getting underway, and one of my graduate students will make this the topic of his PhD. Let me skip over there. Another student has been working on this Mountaineer project. This is the Deep Saline Aquifer project in the Ohio River Valley. It's actually on the West Virginia side of the border. Anybody know why it's in West Virginia? Anybody ever hear of Robert Byrd? It's a very influential senator from West Virginia, and because it's in West Virginia, Robert Byrd supported this project, and because he supported the project, it exists. Welcome to the real world, everybody. That's the way it works. You know. Geologically, it would have been much better to move the project 100 miles into Ohio. Okay, but Robert Byrd was not representing Ohio. The goal, here's a big stack of different kinds of rock units. It's a very, very stable part of the world. Geologically, it couldn't be more boring. Everything's just sort of stacked up on top of each other. They're very old sedimentary rocks. There's Cambrian, pre-Cambrian, that border right there, 570 million years ago. These things are hardly deformed, a few fractures and faults, but very, very simple geology, all laying on top of each other. Nothing's dipping, nothing's faulted very much. And there's a couple of sands, they're called sands, they're actually hard sandstones, which have been identified as possible deep saline aquifers. Now, this is really great if it works, because we have 183 coal-burning power plants in the Ohio River Valley alone. And so wouldn't it be great if, just on the footprint of the power plant, we could just drill a hole, we can separate out the CO2 and just inject it locally. It never leaves. There's no capture, there's no transportation. And in fact, new plant designs, and I don't really understand how it's done, but I am told new plant design can be, if you know you want to segregate the CO2, you can actually do it very efficiently at the time the plant is built. So you don't even have to have the separation costs later on. So like the next generation of power plants would be all, would have the CO2 separated out, would have a separate stream, you drill a hole, you inject it locally. 183 plants are not contributing much to CO2 in the atmosphere at all. Yeah.
So what, after you inject it in the limestone, are you making this, is the process that you just leave it down there until it becomes limestone?
Well, that's the question then, is whether or not we can assume it's going to stay there for about 1,000 years. And I'll get back to that. Okay, but that's a key question. Not only can you put it in there, but will it stay there? So, will this work? Now, what these are sort of perspective views of computer models. And what we're showing here is the permeability, how easy it is for the fluid to move through the pore space. And this is the porosity, the amount of pore space. And this is our injection well, and we've used the hydraulic pressure, which is a way of kind of stimulating the permeability, getting the fluid out of the well a little bit more efficiently. The variability here is just a total fiction. We use techniques known as geostatistics to try to, replicate the kind of variability that's natural in the Earth. And of course, we only have one well, and we've, populated these models with data from a single well, which is totally inadequate. But to make up for that inadequacy, we'll run these models 1,000 times, kind of mixing the parameters in different kinds of ways, and try then to, incorporate the range of possibilities that might be in the real Earth. So, what do we find? We find that if you look at the injection rate, now what does this well have to do? It has to take all the CO2 from that plant and put it into this sandstone called the Rose Run. We have various scenarios. We take the most optimistic scenario is on the order of about 300 to 400 gigatons, kilotons per year. And this particular plant alone is doing 7 megatons per year. So we're, let's see, that's 1/20th of the solution. So we either need 20 wells, or we need 10 wells and 2 zones, okay? So, it's not easy, but it's not inconceivable, okay? And that's what the challenge is trying to understand, what the range of possibilities are, and that's what the research is all about. Let me switch to unminable coal seams. CO2 sequestration is being considered in coal seams in the United States and Alaska. There's a lot of coal in the United States and Alaska. There's a lot of coal in Russia. There's some coal in India and South Africa and Australia and Eastern Europe. I mean, coal is widespread around the world. Of course, there's a lot of coal in China, and that's a huge fear because with China's rapidly growing economy, there's very little traditional oil and gas in China, but there's a lot of coal. And it's hard to get the Chinese just to put scrubbers on coal-burning power plants, much less take the extra step to deal with CO2. But of course, there are a lot of groups working on that. We're looking here at the Powder River Basin, which is in Wyoming, South Dakota, and Montana. This is the Powder River Basin. This kind of orange blob on here is not a blob, but they're individual wells. There are about 12,000 wells that have already been drilled, and they're drilled to produce methane out of the coal. Okay? It's a very good business. Methane is selling at historically high prices. It's never been higher. And by basically pumping water out of shallow wells, you lower the pressure, and then the methane kind of bubbles out. The methane is produced by bacteria in the water that eat the coal, and they sort of fart out the methane, and the methane then gets absorbed to the coal platelet. So it stays there in an absorbed phase, and then by lowering the pressure in the water, the methane will bubble off and come out the well, and then go into the pipeline and be produced. There are some CO2 pipelines in the area, and it's a great place to actually consider this process. Now, what's really good about coal is, unlike oil and gas reservoirs and aquifers, when you put the CO2 in, it doesn't just stay there as sort of a bubble floating around. It actually gets absorbed to the coal. So it stays sequestered in a sort of a fixed form. Okay? That's the good news. The bad news is that we don't know a whole lot about this. If you're exploiting, Helen said they went to the San Ardo oil field, Highway 101, toward Los Angeles, about 120 50 miles south of here today. That oil field has been under development for probably 50 years or so. And over those 50 years, geologists and engineers have learned a lot about that oil field. But in the case of these coals, and in the case of the saline aquifers, there was only one hole into that place under Mountaineer because there's nothing there. There's no reason to drill holes. There's no reason to learn about it. So you don't have the infrastructure of data or the knowledge obtained that you would have in an oil field to work to your advantage. So we don't know a whole lot. Coal is complicated, and I'll talk about this in a minute. And some more good news is what you'll see is that the CO2 gets absorbed preferentially to the methane. So as you pump in the CO2, it gets trapped and kicks off the methane. Okay, and that's good because then the methane can be, it's the least onerous greenhouse gas producing hydrocarbon. So you can sell that to offset the cost and you sequester the CO2. This is simply showing the absorption as a function of pressure, and see the CO2 is way up here, the methane is down there. All that's telling you is that the CO2 wants to attach itself to the coal far more than the methane does. And so the CO2 gets attached and the methane gets liberated. But it's complicated, and it's complicated in part by the structure of the coal. Coal has lots of fractures in it, and they're called face cleats and butt cleats, and these little terms have been, they come out of the mining industry, and it defines how easy it is for the miners to dig the coal out and so on. But nonetheless, there's fractures that run in a sort of orthogonal set. And then, inside what's called the matrix of the coal, there's little cracks and pores, okay? And what you have to do is you have to allow for the methane to get displaced by the CO2 in those little cracks and pores in the coal matrix, which has all the surface area, in order for this to be effective. And so we're trying to understand this, we're trying to model it, and it's a difficult process. We're building these kinds of geomechanical, geostatistical flow models, and okay, so the variability in these different flow models are again the geostatistics, but one of the most important parameters in all our models are what are these cleats doing? What are those orthogonal fractures doing? And the short answer is we don't know. And because we don't know, it's really hard to constrain the calculations. It's easy to run the models, but it's hard to know which of the models are correct. Okay, so we have places to put it. They're abundant around the world. They better be abundant if we're going to be injecting at a rate on the order of about 1/3 of all the oil and gas production around the world. But do we know what all the risks are? Have the biggest risks been identified? Well, one of the risks that have been identified that I haven't even talked about has nothing to do with geology. It has to do with the fact that some of these oil fields have, some of the big fields, Teapot Dome has 1,500 wells, and Teapot Dome is a fairly big field by eastern Wyoming standards. In the Middle East, it's just rubbish, compared to the huge oil fields in the Middle East, which have thousands and thousands of wells drilled over, 50 or 60 years. And one of the biggest wild cards is what the condition of those old wells are. Because when the wells are drilled, they're drilled, then you put steel casing in the wells, then you pump cement down the center of the steel casing, and it comes up around the outside and seals the steel casing to the rock. Then you perforate, you actually shoot a hole through the steel and the cement at the depth at which you want to produce oil. Okay? It works more or less well. I mean, that's what the oil industry standardly does. But what's happened to the steel and what's happened to the cement over 50 years? And what happens when it comes into contact with CO2? CO2, in the presence of water, is an extraordinarily strong and corrosive acid. Okay? And acid will dissolve cement
the cement has a lot of calcite in it, okay? And so, it's just horrendous to think that when we start injecting it in oil fields, for example, it's just going to leak right out, regardless of what's happening in the reservoir, it's just going to leak right out around the oil casing. So that's a huge problem, and nobody knows really how huge it is, and what, so it's a huge concern, okay, that you pump it in and it just leaks right out the outside of the well. Leakage of abandoned oil wells. When oil wells are abandoned, they're supposed to be, it's called P&A, plug and abandon. And they're supposed to pump cement into the wells at various depths to protect the aquifers at shallower depths. But record keeping is not great. It's not clear that it's always done as well as it should. And so and sometimes you don't even know where the abandoned wells are. Okay? Leakage due to inadequate caprock characterization. This is that it's coming up through the rocks that provide the seal on the oil and gas reservoir. This is something kind of we're working on. And we're going to put it in there. We want it to stay in there for 1,000 years. And we have to have permits, right? You can't just go do this. We have to have a government approval. And if you were an approving body, what would you do before you granted a permit? I know what I would do. I'd say prove it. And what I mean by prove it is prove that, it's staying where you're putting it, over, the foreseeable future, and give you the confidence to project. In other words, you have to monitor it. And monitoring efforts through time is going to be part of every one of these projects, whether we like it or not. Now, we do things to manage risks all the time. There's pipelines, and we kind of label them. This is a CO2 pipeline, obviously, but you see signs of your gas pipeline so nobody accidentally digs a trench and blows themselves to gain income. We can monitor how the pressure and ejection rate is consistent. If we find leaking wells, we can try to remediate them, and of course it's going to require effective regulatory oversight. We know that a very small amount of CO2 leakage up out of a reservoir or repository will be very deleterious to the environment. And so the numbers that are thrown around is that the leakage rate must be less than 0.1% per year, 1 part per thousand of what's being ejected. I don't know how reliable a number this is. I can imagine that in some environments, that number could be larger, and other environments it might be smaller. But nonetheless, if you're going to put the CO2 in there, you've got to be confident that it's going to stay there. It's going to cost money to do this. Both before you build your repository, as you're doing it, and then through time, you'll probably have to do repeated seismic surveys through time to make sure it stays there. You want it to stay there for 1,000 years, you might want to do a seismic survey every decade or so. That's 100 seismic surveys per site. Okay? It's going to increase the cost of doing all this. Maybe only by 10%. It's an expensive business. And that's it's not a showstopper, it's just something difficult that has to be undertaken as part of the overall process. Yeah.
Was 1,000 years chosen arbitrarily, or is there
not so much arbitrarily, but kind of a number that gets us out of the fossil fuel era. Okay? By about 1,000 years, we will have burned everything that's burnable. In terms of oil and gas, and coal, and okay? And, presumably, if it starts leaking at about 1,000 years, it's not all, this question of CO2 is not all going to leak at once. And, it's a kind of very large number, much longer than our lifetime, but not inconceivable that seems intuitively right. But it's not it's not a it's just kind of a gut feeling kind of number. And we need to have kind of remediation scheme when you do have leaking wells, or you do have migration into groundwater, or you do have things like CO2 accumulating on the bottom of lakes, which we know from African lakes can even occur as a natural process and have devastating consequences when the lakes turnover. So the injection and the process of putting it in, we need to demonstrate that we can store it for a long period of time. We need to be able to, have a site selection criteria so we can get after it. It's a huge problem. This problem can't wait. If you guys do nothing until you're as old as I am now, the game is over. The game is over. I'm taking Hawaiian vacations in Alaska. Seriously, you can't wait 30 years. It's just impossible. Reconciling top-down and bottom-up capacity estimates. There's a whole lot of people working on this from an economic point of view, from a policy point of view, and a handful of us working on it from a scientific point of view. And when you look at some of the numbers that are thrown around, how much CO2 can we put in deep aquifers? How much CO2 can we put in abandoned oil and gas wells? How much CO2 can we put in coal? Those numbers are huge. And the numbers suggest that it's a can-do problem. But that is taking a very distant view and a very naive view of the realities from a geologic and engineering perspective of how to do it. When you actually engage the problem and you say, okay, here I am at Mountaineer, is this going to be possible? And you build it from the bottom up, you find it's a much more sobering prospect. And, there's a huge gulf between what's being done sort of at the field study level and what's being done sort of in the broad brush policy level that has to get resolved. And we need to figure out how we're going to monitor and verify these protocols because, if we are going to do it and we're going to get started doing it, we need regulatory permission, and therefore we have to establish a regulatory framework which requires protocols. And of these 6 problems, my group is working on 4 of them. We're trying to optimize how to get it in, demonstrate long-term storage integrity, develop criteria for site selection, and I know how to reconcile this, we just ignore this. And we're working on that because this is just fantastic. But nonetheless, it's a huge, huge problem. We're very fortunate at Stanford to have the GSEP program. It's empowering research, not only here, but many other universities. It's truly a global climate and energy problem. We have to provide energy to the world, and yet we can't maintain business as usual without suffering really dire climate consequences. And sort of, and that's the challenge that we have to do. So I'll stop there.